Today, we are going to go behind the scenes as I created a bodyscape focused on dramatic lighting and beautiful texture. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. When I photograph the human form, I do so in so many different ways. Sometimes I am creating characters. Other times I'm shooting abstract nudes. The idea for this shoot actually came from my makeup artist, Joanne Gare. So as we were planning this shoot, we were actually doing a beauty day. And she said, well, I've got a lot of foundation, a lot of powders that I want to get rid of. Can we do something with them? And so at first our concept was just to cover the subject's face with the powders, do some close-up macros, which we did shoot. But then we figured out, why not just use even more and cover her body in it? Ashley is a model that I use very often. And so she's very used to us doing crazy things together. We've covered her in glitter and painted her face. And so she was thankfully on board for letting us cover her in powder. Now, even though this is a very dramatic image, it's actually relatively simply achieved. So let's take a look behind the scenes. Now, in the behind the scenes, what we actually did is we elevated her. She's on a table, and then we put some pads and things underneath so she could support herself. And the reason that I wanted to do that is I wanted to be able to light some way, perhaps with a gradient behind her. But if she's lying on the floor, it would be difficult to get a light that low. So putting her on a table would allow me a little bit more flexibility with my lighting. All right, so taking a look behind the scenes. First of all, the idea is that I wanted to go with textures and warm tones. And so we covered her in light beige, a medium beige, a dark brown. We basically took these little palettes of powder and just ground them up. And then we used a little sifter as we put them on her skin. But then to continue through with the theme of warmth, I selected a Savage Universal beige background. I wanted to unify her skin tone, the texture, and the color of the background. And then I would do it even more in post-processing, which you're going to see later on. All right, so let's actually begin with our main light. The main light is back behind the subject. This is something called short light. It means that the shadows fall towards the camera. The highlights are on the side away from camera. This is fantastic anytime you want to emphasize texture and dimension. If I took the same image and I moved the light around to the front and I flat lit it, there wouldn't be all this beautiful detail and texture. It's the fact that the light is coming around from behind is what's giving us that a lot of dimension to both her body and to the powder. So we had a beauty dish, and the reason that I added a grid is because I didn't want the light to hit the background. I didn't want it to spill because I wanted control over the background. I wanted it to be dark. And this close, the beauty dish without the grid, there'd probably be a little bit unwanted spill, unwanted bounced light. All right, so next up, we have our second light. There's only two lights in the scene. The light that we're using is behind the subject on a floor stand, and I'm using a Photo D2 with a 10-degree grid. So what that does is it gives me just a little glow of light. And I have it pointed low so I can have it a little bit lower in the frame. This is going to give me separation. It's also going to light that beige background, which again is going to be important to the overall color. Now, before we move on to see what was done in post-processing, let's actually take a look at our camera and camera settings. I was shooting with the Canon R5 and the Canon RF 70-200 2.8. I was shooting at f11 because I wanted to see all of that detail and all of that texture. Now, the 70-200 is probably not something I would have originally used for a bodyscape because I ended up getting quite a lot of her body in the frame. Typically, I'd use a 24-105, but the reason I had the longer lens on is that I kept moving in my compositions, cropping in closer for details of like the texture on her neck or just on the curve on the side of her body or her stomach. And so it allowed me the flexibility to crop in and get a ton of detail in camera without having to crop in post if I were, for example, shooting only with the 24-105. So I was able to get some really nice tight detail shots. All right, so let's pop over and take a look. Here is our final image. This is what I want you to take a look at. First of all, notice the short light, the light coming back around to the right-hand side of the frame creates this beautiful Rembrandt light on her face. You see that little triangle of light on the shadow side of her face. What I had her do is turn her head and kind of crane up, kind of arch over towards that light just to get that little triangle. I thought it would be much more impactful. It would be a little bit more flattering on her face rather than having the whole face in shadow or the left-hand side that you see here in total shadow. Give a little bit more dimension. Next up, you'll also notice the light that was on the background. I have it pointed basically behind her lower back. That was very much on purpose. Without it being positioned here, this entire beautiful long curve in the lower part of the frame would totally blend into the background and it would just make the picture really flat. So I have a little bit more glow there. And I had an assistant, once I found my composition, adjust that grid so that it was exactly where I wanted it to be. Another important thing of having her elevated on that table is it allowed me to shoot at this low angle. You can see how dramatic, how dynamic the lines are, how powerful she looks. But if she was on the floor, it would be nearly impossible for me to get the light that I wanted and the angle that I wanted at the same time. So I've got the beauty dish with the grid raking across her body. I also wanted to make sure that I got this little highlight next to her belly button. It was just more flattering on her body. And then I also wanted, again, that separation on the background. So let me show you what I captured in camera. So in camera, it's pretty close. It's not quite right. And I was actually shooting tethered. When I was shooting tethered, I was tweaking. I was filling up the fill light a little bit. I was just kind of dragging the shadow slider. I was adding a little bit of clarity because when I'm photographing texture, clarity emphasizes texture. And then I also overall warmed up the photo and added a little bit of red magenta to the shadows. So this is probably more accurate to skin tones, but I thought that this looked more painterly. You'll notice when I add fill light, see how much more separation that you're getting on the background. That became really important. So this was the image that I was looking at while I was shooting. I don't think that there's that much that needs to be photoshopped. There wasn't that much I wanted to correct, but let me show you what we did in the final retouching portion. So we cleaned up some of the lines on her head, some of the loose hairs, pulled in and smoothed out the line on her neck, cleaned up some of the more distracting elements of the powder. There's some places where it clumped a little bit. And then I also retouched out the left-hand side where her fingers were kind of hanging off of her neck. I thought that that ruined the smooth line of the neck there. And then lastly, if we zoom in, I actually used generative fill to give her a very dark but still there fingertip because you couldn't see it at all here, so it just looked like her finger got cut off. I don't want it to be bright, but I did want you to get a hint of it there. So I actually selected and then in generative fill in Photoshop typed fingertip and it added it there for me. So when we move back to look at the entire image, from what was captured in camera to the final image, basically it was just a little bit of color grading and then filling in the shadows and playing around with clarity, but it was really close. One of the things that I did in this image that really broke a rule is you'll see that I cropped her off at the shoulder. I cropped her off at the shoulder here and her arm was basically hanging out where she was kind of leaning. It was extending beyond the frame. And a few times I brought the arm in because I was like, oh, well, I don't want her to be cropped there. So I brought the arm in and then it kind of came to the side of the body. But I felt like it distracted from all of the beautiful clean lines that we have here. So in the end, even though I broke a rule, I feel like the way that she's posed created a dynamic composition. And because the shoulder is in shadow, I don't think it was quite as jarring. I still feel like you focus on beautiful curves, not the chopping off at the limb. I love the image that we came up with, and it really all began with my makeup artist wanting to get rid of some powder. So there is always ways to be resourceful and use that to help you come up with ideas. If you enjoy photographing the nude form, I have an event coming up called the Bare Elegance event. This is a 3-day workshop with multiple instructors, including myself. On the first day, we photograph fine art nudes. On the second day, it's burlesque and fetish. On the third day, it's all about boudoir. So if you want to join me in person, be sure to check out the links in the description below because there's only a few seats and this is a one-time event. Now, if you can't join me for the Bare Elegance event, if you go to learnwithlindsay.com, I have 2 different classes dedicated to photographing the human form and fine art nudes. I hope you guys enjoyed this photo deconstruction. If you want to see the gear that I use to make these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below, and of course, visit adorama.com. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I encourage you to like and subscribe and to share with friends because I have so many more images and deconstructions just like this one coming your way. See you next time, guys.